writing as a meditation, I was just thinking whether it adds to your mental problem or it will reduce your mental problem. But if you think, what do we want in this era of pandemic? What is we have been like the last 2 years, we are at our homes, we are not having much real interaction, only virtual interactions are possible.
True.
The first thing for the mental healthness is to be comfortable with yourself. One has to be comfortable with oneself. One has to be comfortable with the company of oneself. All other relationships starts from there. If you are not comfortable with yourself, then you will not be comfortable with the world. You will not be comfortable with anyone else. And writing is a method of knowing oneself. So we'll discuss it as we go forward, but I'll put it like this. Writing is one of the best ways to know yourself. It's a journey, it's a quest. And you need not be a published writer, professional writer, and all those things. It happens by happenstance. Maybe some are passionate, some want to publish. But writing as such is something which most of us are fortunate to do. All of us are literate. And this is one thing which I think should be the habit of, which I think every one of us should make it a habit. Writing a journal, writing a diary, writing to know yourself.
So, if I may say, you're saying that writing is a form of meditation because it is also about getting into a trance of sorts where you actually enjoy the journey. And let me ask you one thing. How do you cultivate the writing mindset? Because for you, it comes very naturally. You're an creative person. You've been a cartoonist and you're a painter too, as I know. And so it comes very naturally to you. So some of us who want to get into the writing profession or want to take it a little more seriously, what are the steps they must take?
See, there are two things. One is there are two kinds of writing. One, as I said, like writing a journal or a diary, which can be done by anyone and which should be done by anyone, if you ask me. The other part I will come in the second part of my answer. The first part is when you start a day, if you write what you want. I'm not talking about a to-do list. That's a totally different thing.
Right.
But if you just jot down it need not be, ideally you should write with a pen or a pencil on a paper, but if it is not possible, just type it in your phone or somewhere, just put it in words. Your thoughts, you put it in words. It gives a lot of clarity. Why the writing was invented, why it has sustained the human civilization. If you see, the human civilization's growth coincided with the invention of writing or recording your thoughts. Printing was a method of recording your thought. Audio recording also is a method of recording your thought. Video is also a method of recording your thought, because thoughts are scattered. It's a method of capturing your thoughts. Whether you are a professional writer, creative person, or whether you are a businessman, whether you are a sports person, whether you are a musician, it doesn't matter. Your thoughts keep getting scattered. Writing is a way of focusing your thoughts. So in the morning when you wake up, apart from other routines, you might be doing yoga, some might be doing prayers. All those things are good. But if you can put 3 or 4 lines somewhere, note it down. Today, how the day want to be. I'm not talking about to-do list. That's a separate thing. Again, I'm repeating it. What am I feeling now? Yeah. How much connected I am to the world? How much connected I am to the people around me? And when you go to sleep, you just complete it, what you started. I practice this and it gives a lot of calm to your mind, calmness, and it gives an orientation to your life. You are writing for yourself, so you are not worried about grammar, you are not worried about how good your language is or which language you write from, whichever you are comfortable, maybe half English, half Bengali, half whichever language, your mother tongue, Malayalam, Hindi, whatever it is, or whichever way, it doesn't matter, it's just a matter of capturing your thought. That is for everyone. Now, if you specifically want to become a writer, as in the one who tells stories or the one who writes about something like, say, could be a sports writer, you could be a journalist. But if you are going into the professional level, the only way to write is to write. It might be funny when I say that, but Many people have this misconception that writing just comes from somewhere. There's a muse or it just flows from somewhere. No, it's like any other art. Ask yourself, if you are a musician or a sportsman, how much practice you would have done before you get into the, if you're a cricketer, how many hours of practice you do before you get into a pitch? If you are a sports person or if you are a dancer, how many years of practice you do before you get into, if you are a musician, how many years of practice you do before you get into the stage? Recently, I was reading an interview of KJ Yeshudas, and he was telling still he practices for 4 to 5 hours a day at the age of 84. After having a 70 years or 60, 65 years of career, after singing more than 1.5 lakh songs, he still practices.
True.
So when you are thinking about writing professionally, how much practice you had of writing? And for writing professionally, there are two kind of practice. One is reading, read extensively, read widely. More than depth, you need a wider reading. Read a lot. So 70% of your practice will consist of reading, 30% will be actually writing.
Correct.
Actually writing the story, and over by doing more and more practice only, you perfect it. It's like any other art form. There is nothing, you may have some talent of writing, that is of course needed, but to reach a level you want as a professional level or something where it is published, it is well read and all, the more you practice, the more you get better. Just imagine how much time Virat Kohli might be practicing.
Correct.
How much time Tendulkar would have been practicing when he was in his peak. It's the same way.
True.
There's no magic in it.
Yeah, I remember one of your sessions, I think for Avani Foundation, where you mentioned about, I'm just digressing a bit, but I'm coming back to the same point. You talked about, the rituals that you follow. You're not pro ritualism, but you said the 2-3 things that I follow in the day that helps you. And you said these are things we should all follow to develop that mindfulness to achieve those listed objectives in a day. So if you could elaborate on that for the benefit of our audience.
First of all, I would like to dispense a small misunderstanding people have about meditation. Meditation, if you go to our scriptures and other things, we are now practicing only one kind of meditation. Sitting at one place, maybe you change the poses different, but only one kind of meditation you are practicing. You are just closing your eyes and looking into yourself and doing some breathing exercise and trying to control your mind. That is very, what you call it's a base level of meditation, a beginner's meditation or one kind of meditation. Nothing wrong with that. Some people it works. But Buddha talks about almost 80 kinds of meditation. So even contemplation is a kind of meditation. Walking is a kind of meditation.
True.
Just sitting and watching the sunset or sunrise is a kind of meditation. Feeling the breeze on your skin is a kind of meditation.
True.
Eating food is a kind of meditation. Eating food, talking to someone is a kind of meditation. So meditation is not just sitting and closing your eyes and looking into yourself. That is, if you ask me, it's very restrictive kind of meditation. It can be used as a starting for somebody if you want to do it. Many people, it doesn't work. For me, it doesn't work at all. I cannot sit at one place and try to concentrate. I would rather set my mind free, and I would allow that mind to go far and wide, spread all over and capture whatever is there, the beauty, the ideas from the world, and bring it back to me, rather than chaining it inside darkness of my mind and staring into it. That is not my kind of meditation. So the dispelling of this myth that meditation is all about sitting cross-legged in some positions, or like how some quack swamis are, I won't call them quack, perhaps they're good businessmen. They sell it, saying that I will teach you how to breathe, or I will teach you how to do this and that. Maybe it may work for someone, but many people it may not work. The reason is that there is no one right way. There is no way which it could be coached. Maybe it would have worked for that particular person, but it did not work for you. More importantly, it is about freeing your mind, letting your mind go free, and allowing it to bring back ideas, allowing it to bring back the beauty, allowing it to be alive is what is more important for me. So for doing this, what I do is, one is I have some routine, like most of the days, I watch the sunrise, I watch the sunset, I love, unless there is a, say, the program is there now, the sunset, maybe in Calcutta already it would have happened. Here it is just happening, but I won't be able to watch it. But other than that, on normal days, I make it a point to do that. This all helps me to orient myself to what is happening around, to the environment. I feel aware, and this helps me in writing also. So when I put words into my paper, most of the times I write with, even now I write with pen and this thing. Even though I use software after that for editing and other things, various softwares, professional level softwares. Mostly I write with my pen most of the time, and it gives me the whatever I have observed during these 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the evening. My mind wanders and I get a lot of ideas and I use it. This helps me to be, I don't know, maybe eccentric or maybe calm or creative, whatever you call, but it helps me a lot in doing what I want to do.
So there's a science you mentioned in that, which is like getting up early in the morning to see the sunrise it has its own benefits. I mean, because it kind of connects you with the universe and the larger universe, and you're able to put things in order in your mind. And then similarly at sunset, and similarly during the full noon or during that period. You mentioned on that. Can you just take a few points, I mean, tell us something about that as to why you think so?
See, one of the fundamental things is our awareness of time. We are all busy, but we are not aware of time. That's what is happening. One problem with the modern life. Perhaps there are a lot of benefits of modern life. I am the last person to deny the benefit of modern life. Science has given us so many things, but especially when you are living in big cities like Mumbai or Calcutta or Dhaka or Chennai or wherever you are, you have a feeling that time just passes you by. You don't know where the time has gone. So what waking up early in the morning gives you, I wake up 4:30, something like that. So what it gives is, it gives you a lot of time. Actually, that 2 hours in the morning up to say sunrise, 6:30, is worth another 6 hours of a normal time. If somebody is not waking up early, they should try this. Initially, 1 or 2 weeks, it might be difficult. Of course, there are physiological reasons. Some people cannot wake up in the morning. They are more active in the night. But unless you experiment with that, you will not know what kind of person you are. If you are a morning person, what they call the lark, then I think waking up in the Brahma Muhurta around 4:30 early in the morning, that 2 hours, you get a lot of awareness about time. The time slows down. Time is always relative. Even though mechanically you divide it into 24 hours, it is all hours are not the same. You would have experienced that. When you watch the sunrise, when you watch the sunset, you are again marking the time and aligning yourselves to the rhythm of the world. We are lucky that we are in a tropical country. Most of our time is days and nights are not very long or very short. They are almost equally divided. So it helps us in having this, aligning us to the rhythm of the nature. So you sleep when you are intended to sleep, you wake up when you are intended to wake up. And this is a very important fact in maintaining your mental calmness. You may have seen all religions, if you see, they have prayers at this time, whether it is Islam or Hinduism or Christianity, the early morning prayers. They all mark time, morning prayers, afternoon prayers, or Sandhya Vandan or Namas, they all mark time. Why? Because the humans over the so many thousand years, they have experimented and found out what makes people feel good. All these religions or spirituality are for people, for them to feel good, right? Other things are secondary, other temptations or other things like you will get heaven, hell, all those things are secondary things. Mainly these all deal with the human mind. So they all have found the rhythm, and there is a reason why they have found it. So you follow that. It's the simplest thing you can do rather than going for a quick solution.
True. So now I want to get back to your writing. And one of the things I see is that you actually glorify villains. and they mute them into heroes by as we normally see them. Ravana is considered a villain in the north of India, for example. Duryodhana, for example, is seen as a negative character. But you actually pick them up and create interesting heroes out of them. So, and they sell like hotcakes. So I want to ask, what makes you do that? What is so exciting about these characters, and who are the other characters writing on?
Prashant, there is no concept of proper villain in Indian Puranas. I have mentioned it in a few of my other interviews also.
I'm only saying it from the North Indian perspective.
North Indian perspective changed because of historical reasons. There are many worldviews, but basically, if you see all the Eastern religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, Confucianism, they have a different worldview than all the religions which came from the Middle East. I'm not saying one is correct, one is wrong, both have its advantage, disadvantage and all, but these things got merged. For example, in the Abrahamic, what we call the Abrahamic religion, like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, it's about the things are clearly marked in the sense that this is right versus wrong, God versus Satan or devil or whatever you call it, sin versus virtue, heaven versus hell. Whereas the Eastern religions is cyclic in nature. It's all about the play of karma. So there is only good karma and bad karma, and this good and bad itself is relative. And for your karma, you will have karma bala. It's like a cycle going on and on and on. So when Ramayana and Mahabharata was written, they were not familiar with this idea of hero and a villain. So if you go into the Puranas, you find that Ravan is none other than the bodyguard of Vishnu who came because of a curse. So they took 3 lives, Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu, Ravana and Kumbhakarna, and Kamsa and Shishupala, or in some legends, Dandavakra. So they take 3 lives and they are paying for their karma. And Ram also comes, Vishnu also comes as Ram, and he is fighting this so that to teach the people about this cycle of karma. So Rama, it will be, if you see it from the eyes of a Abrahamic religion, it will sound, that's why many Westerners have found it so confusing. Because God is perfect in the Abrahamic religion. Here, Ram is God, but he is not God also. He is the avatar of God. He is the human avatar of God, and humans have flaws. Krishna is a human avatar of God, so they have flaws.
Right.
So what it teaches is Ram also does some action, and he also pays for the action. It may happen in that life or the next life, because here there is no end. Unlike if I may call geographically, if I may call it as Western religions, and all these things as the Eastern religion, there is a clear mark. You have one life, you die, then there is a judgment day. You wait for the judgment day. You are judged, and you go to heaven or hell. Very simply, there is more complication on that, but very simply I put it. Here there is no beginning or end. Here it's a cyclic. All these Eastern religions are cyclic. So in the South, where these invasions and other things had not happened so much, still that old philosophy is continuing. So Ravana is not considered evil. He is considered as a Shivabhakt who did evil things. These are 2 different things. Somebody being evil and somebody doing some evil things are 2 different things. So Ram is a god, but still he did some bad things, like abandoning Sita. So he pays the price for that in Krishna Avatar. Like that, it goes on and on and on and as a cycle.
Right.
So Ravana is also revered, Duryodhana is also revered, Krishna is also revered, Rama is also revered. So I come from that culture. So I wrote it so that all the television series, which I also became part of later, but when I wrote Asura, I was not a part of the television series, had followed even Tulasidas Ramayana was written in the era after the contact with this religions. So their sensitivity also played a part in how the story was told. So the Ram became the perfect man, and Ravan became the perfect evil man. and the duality started playing. That is why this dichotomy is there when suddenly you see the versions, different versions. So I was just following the tradition in which the Hinduism in which I grew up. That's all. It was not intentionally that I'm going to glorify it and going to offend a lot of people. I was just showing.
I remember your TEDx talk on perspectives. Everything is a perspective, right? That hit me very hard. It was just reinforcement of the same facts that it's all about perspective. Your perspective versus my perspective. Ram's perspective versus Ravan's perspective, right? Duryodhana's perspective versus Yudhishthira's perspective. So great. We've got a lot of questions coming in. Instead of me asking continuously questions from my viewpoint, I think let's involve people now. So there's a question from Rotarian Mr. Subramaniam from Madras, Chennai. Good evening, dear all. Okay, that's not a question. It's just a question on Anand from Mr. Anirban Datta. What lessons from Mahabharata are extremely prudent with respect to today's scenario for keeping mental well-being in a stable state?
Mahabharata, the greatness of Mahabharata is that whichever era you are living, whatever age or gender yours is, you look back into Mahabharata, you will find a character which has faced the same problem like you.
True.
Any era, any place, any country. That is why the Samami Yuge, even though it is told in certain other concept, that becomes the theme of the Mahabharata. One of the great things about Mahabharata is that it still has gray shades, whereas Ramayana underwent due to the contact with many other civilizations, it underwent a change in many parts of the country. But Mahabharata, fortunately, it was told that it should not be read at home. So it is more gray in its shades, and the so-called evil people are not that evil, and the so-called good people are not that good also. Not a single Kaurava warrior was killed using dharma. If you really see the Mahabharata war, every great Maharathi was killed using some trickery or other. There is what it teaches now is it doesn't mean that all these people are evil or good, because it teaches about there is no concept of evil or good. It's all about perspective. Every character in Mahabharata is right. There is not a single character who is wrong in Mahabharata. Maybe they have done some wrong deeds, but all their arguments, all what they stood for, from Shigandi to Bhishma to Duryodhana to Dushasana to Draupadi to Ashwatthama to Takshaka to even a minor character, there is no one who is wrong. What it helps us now is that we live in a very difficult times, especially what has happened after the invention of social media. Our opinions are getting, there is no space for grayness. Why? It is a software problem. All these algorithms work to feed you. All these algorithms, you like something, the algorithm thinks you like that more and starts feeding you things similar to that. 5 years you use this, you see only one kind of opinion. So you like X politician and you hate Y politician, whatever may be your politics, it doesn't matter. Earlier days, how it used to be, like if you are into Mahabharata and all, it makes you sit and think about the sides, and you understand that none of them are very good or none of them are very bad. They are just humans with their flaws and other things. Now what is happening with the algorithm of social media, and why we should go back to Mahabharata if possible and read all these things again and again, is this. The algorithm feeds the same kind of things to you. You hear the opinion of the people who are like you, who have the same taste, because it groups them together. And what happens is that you have one set of opinion and you become very intolerant. This and the other side also gets the same way. Other side who is supporting the Y will be getting everything bad about the X, and this side the vice versa. This is not only in the politics, everything, even in your taste, even in what you buy, this is happening. So what books like Mahabharata teaches is there is not just one truth. There are multiple truths which are all equally valid. and it is a context, and from where you are looking it from, which defines what the truth is. Having this kind of concrete opinions on things is what leads to conflict in the society. If somebody says, if someone says my way is a great way, there is nothing wrong with that. Everybody will agree with it. When someone says my way is the only great way and all other ways are bullshit, and the other person tells the other side, then that becomes, that sows the seeds of conflict. Already it has sown the seed of conflict.
Right.
There is no space for perhaps, there is no space for maybe. And Mahabharata brings that maybe or perhaps into it.
Nice. So I have one question coming up from one of the Rotary members. Can you tell us why not all these great script writers are scripts are adopted or added as proper subjects? This is the question. It's not coming out very clearly. One may often assemble certain thoughts from obscurity, put those ideas into paper and try to elaborate on it. Is it actually necessary to stick to any spiritual aspects for one to succeed as a writer? Or should one just flow with their natural instincts and emotions?
I would like to ask, what is spiritual? Unless you mean the other spirit.
Yes.
What is spiritual? There is, see, spirituality has got a very bad name. What you are, that is spiritual. So if you find that is your way, that is what which you gives you happiness, and you are able to find it, you follow. There is no rules like you have to do it exactly like this or that, especially in any art form for that matter. It is your self-expression. Once you go to certain art forms like films, yes, you have to write in a particular software, you'll have to write in a particular method. Why? Because film scripts or television scripts, unlike novels or poetry or short story, are not complete art forms. They are the blueprints for a director, an actor, and 100 other people to work upon. So that will need, that's a technical thing. Script writing is a technical thing. Other than that, any form of writing, poetry is the most free form of writing, the most expressive one, and the least paid one also. That's irony. Unfortunately, in this era. But otherwise, if you are writing, just go by your flow. Don't worry about the format, whether it is spiritual or not, whether it pleases somebody or not. Just go by the flow. You are the only one you have to please.
Great. So I have a question from our friend Sumit Balan. He writes, please give us an explanation the difference between anti-villain, noble villain, and anti-hero. I mean, I think he's talking in terms of how you project your characters.
See, there are many people, there are many characters who achieve, like anti-hero, if you ask me. There are characters like, say, Karna, or perhaps not even Karna, I will say many of them, say Robin Hood, who achieve a noble cause through wrong or unethical means, which is not good, which may not what the society dictates. They break the rule, but get there. They are one kind of people. Another kind of people is there which are difficult to, who become one of the most difficult people to tackle. Like people like Ravan, we can call as anti-villain. They are not villain. They are not evil in as such evil, right? There are lots of characters in history like that. They do the correct thing. They are highly accomplished. They are brave, courage. They have every qualities to be the ideal hero. Yet they use it for some other purpose. They don't want to create evil in the evil way. I will put in modern history, I will put the example as Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is a great hero and a great villain. He's an anti-villain, if you ask me. He was the one who was worse than Hitler, who killed almost 35 lakh people in Calcutta in the Great Calcutta Famine. We may not be reading about it much because our history books are all, I don't know what. But he killed 35 lakh Indians, mostly poor Indians, mostly belonging to, especially the, to read history, the poorer classes, the lower castes, the Muslims and all those people. 35 lakh people officially perished. More than 70 or 80 lakhs would have gone. Hitler has not killed those many people. But why he killed that? Because he believed to win the war and to defeat Hitler, the England and the Europe needed all the grains. So he shifted all the grains from here. He was not intending to become a villain, but he became the greatest villain.
Yeah.
And he was a hero somewhere else. So for Ravan, he's a hero for Rakshas, Asuras, right? He did everything right for them. He gave them a big empire. So these are like anti-villains. Then there is another category, what we call as noble villains. In Purana, if you take Mahabali as an example, his goodness is the reason for his fall. There is no flexibility in his goodness. He is good always. Even Lord Ram tends to be that towards the end of his life. When he has gurus and all, he hesitates to kill Tadaka, but Vishwamitra says, you will have to kill her, and he kills. But as he goes, as he ages, his goodness becomes bad. Like he has to abandon Sita because he has to be good among people.
Right.
It's a warning. That is why in Krishna Avatar, it comes, Ram is called Purna Avatar and Krishna is called Paripurna Avatar, because Krishna is not as good as Ram. He has a balance. He's bad when necessary, good when necessary. So noble villains, Mahabali, as I said, is a great example. He could be only defeated through his own nature of giving whatever he is asked.
Right.
Bali becomes another kind of noble villain. He could have killed Sugriva. He never killed Sugriva. If he was a real villain, he would have killed Sugriva. But he follows a straight path and ends up doing bad. So these are all great characterization which happens across history, and especially in Ramayana and Mahabharata. So many characters are there which you can. Ashwatthama again becomes an unintentional anti-villain kind of thing. He's the greatest Maharathi. Perhaps he was. Some say he was greater than Karna and Arjuna, except for the Brahmastra, which was not taught. Everything else he knew, and finally he ended up doing the worst of all things, right? But he was right when he did that.
Yep.
So these characters become, that is why we want to read it and reread it, all these things, not as a religious book, not as a spiritual book, but as a journey into the human psychology. And this teaches us a lot about our life. You can, of course, read it as a religious book. That's another way. But this is also a way to read it.
So I've got another question, a flurry of questions, actually. One question from Mr. Roy, who writes, respected sir, is the Mahabharata, in the Mahabharata war, we come across the character of Ghatotkacha, Rajkumar Bhim's son. I don't pronounce it correctly. He was a Rakshasa and was not directly involved with the war. He was just used as a bait to make Karna use his Shakti Astra, with which Karna could have easily killed Arjun. So how does Karma play its role here? There was no perfect reason for Ghatotkacha lost his life. It would be of great help if you could clarify regarding this matter.
You have to go to the end of Krishna to understand that. Even Krishna is not spared. So that is why we get confused with the God, God concept, G with the capital, the God concept and other things. So these are two different philosophies. That's why this confusion arises. We were ruled by British and all. So we tend to see through their eyes also. But now, 2-3 things. It needs a slightly elaborate answer. So you'll have to give me that if it wants to be clear. Ram kills a lot of Asuras who were just doing their duty. They were fighting for their king, right? You look it from Asura's point of view. Whoever except Ravan would have done something bad, he would have kidnapped Ram's wife. But the other Asuras, they were just doing their duty, like any country soldiers doing their duty. But Ram is forced to kill them. Now, what happens is, the next birth, all these Asuras, including Ghatotkacha, in many versions, they are all the rebirths of these Asuras. And all the, even Ghatotkacha's death, Krishna has to pay the price for that. How he has to pay the price? Ram killed all these Asuras to protect his wife. Correct. That is a karma. How does the Karmavela act? in the Krishna avatar, when the Dwaraka is sinking, three things act. One is Ram's action in threatening the sea, that whatever stones my monkey army puts, it has to float. He is going against the nature. Mm-hmm. But since he is Ram, Varuna agrees. But Varuna says, you will pay the price one day for making me do it. Ram says, it's all right. Now this is what I want. I am going to do it. I'll pay the price when it requires. In Krishna avatar, the same sea comes back to destroy Dwaraka made of stones. That is the karma acting. That is one level. Second level, Gandhari's curse. Gandhari curses that just like how you made and enjoyed my sons and my sister-in-law's sons, that is Kunti's sons, fight each other and kill each other, let it happen in Yadavas also. So Krishna again is paying the karma for the Mahabharata war. The war doesn't spare even Krishna. The Krishna's entire people die off fighting each other, just like how Kauravas and Pandavas were there. Third karma will have how it is acting. All these Rakshasas of Ravan, they take birth as the barbarians, and Krishna, before he knows his life is going to end, who is coming back? Bali is coming back as Jara, the hunter who kills Krishna. Okay, how he kills? Jara also hides behind a tree, and just like how Ram had shot, Bali shoots Krishna in his toe. But before that death, there is one thing which happens which many people might have skipped it because it is so cruel. In the temple renderings, they don't say it. Krishna calls Arjuna and tells that my 16,000 wives, 8 wives follow him. The 16,000 wives are there who he had saved from Jarasandh or Naragasura as per some version. He had brought them.
Right.
You please take them to Hastinapur, to Indraprastha, because I am going now. So Arjun says, you have done so much for me, I will take them. And he takes them. When he is taking, Krishna dies, and all these Rakshas, they come as barbarians. They come, they defeat Arjuna, they capture the Gandiva, smash it on Arjuna's head, break it into two, and take away all the 16,000 wives of Krishna. And Mahabharata doesn't say what happens to them. Take away. Bhagavata has some explanation. Mahabharata doesn't say. Take away to them. This is the punishment which he gets both for Ramavatar, both for playing Khadotkaj and other plays into it. Krishna is the one who suffers maximum in the end. If you see, he loses the kingdom, he loses his people, he loses his life, he loses his women. Now you can of course ask the question why the women were punished. That I don't have an answer. Why? Because most of those era, or even in this era, people, many of the males' ego is so fragile that they attach it to the female. Whether they are marrying somebody, not marrying somebody, maybe all those flaws are there as a story in that also. But I am talking it in that philosophical angle, in that story world, that everything makes sense. So even Kadotgaja's death and Ram killing the innocent Asuras who are fighting for their king and doing their duty, everything comes back to bite him. And this cycle keeps on going from birth to birth, to birth to death, to birth to death. It keeps on going. It's a cycle.
Right. Very nice. So that's quite an elaborate explanation. There are lots of questions actually. There's another question from Mr. Samantha who says, do you think the hero worshipping culture narrowed down the space for discussing different perspective of the different characters in Mahabharata and now Ramayana, all restricted to the subject? I think everybody is very excited about this very subject.
Hero worshipping started with the Bhakti movement. Bhakti movement.
Yes.
See, a culture will have the confidence and courage only when it is at the top. You find that many of the European countries who used to burn people at stakes if they questioned the church or if they questioned the God, blasphemy and all, even as late as 17th century, Or
Right.
as late as 1805 in Goa, when Portuguese were ruling, they killed so many people on Inquisition. These are all the dark history. They suddenly changed, like Scandinavian countries and other people, they suddenly changed and they are now confident enough to question everything. Most of the people have become atheist. India had a phase like that. China had a phase like that when we were confident enough. At that time, there was no scripture in the sense of scripture. All the Upanishad, all these things, all the Brahmanas, not as a caste, I'm talking about the books, they were all based on debates. Even Gita is a debate, if you ask. It's not an instruction, it's not a guidebook. It's a debate. So people keep questioning, it's an endless debate. Shankaracharya went around not with a sword, but debating Buddhists, debating people. His Digvijaya is not that of Alexander. But later, once the invasions happened, and due to various other reasons, there was a sunset period in the Indian civilization. It felt besieged. Now you can find the same scenario. If you see the golden period of Islam, that was when the science flourished. When India was sunsetting, the 500 years in Arabia, when Europe was in darkness, China was withdrawing, India's sunset age had begun, Arabia was flourishing at the golden age.
During the Bhakti movement.
Here, Bhakti movement is happening. Golden age of Islam was happening in Arabia. That is when the calculus and other things were taken from India, elaborated and passed on to Europe.
Yes.
So that was the time after the death of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the 300-400 years, Islam had expanded and was at the top of the world, like what America was once, what India was once, what China was once. And at that time, they started questioning everything. There was a lot of debates on science. Now look at Islam. No offense meant. Now it is under siege. Through America is interfering, they are interfering. Everywhere there is a siege. Suddenly it has gone to a shell. And there is many places, at least, many countries we see, there is a lot of intolerance, like the dark ages of Europe when it was under, whereas Europe came out of it. When India went under this invasion and it went under, what happened is Bhakti movement was a reaction to that. Bhakti movement was finding an ideal man, and it gave a lot of good things. It gave great poetry, it gave great music, a lot of other things. But when intellectualism went away, that debate went away, there is no questioning. You pray to Ram and put everything on his feet, and everything will be all right. So this, from a culture, intellectually it was not wrong. It was a psychological way of dealing with the defeat or a society going under. Same thing, you can witness it now with people get more and more conservative. They don't stop questioning. More kind of religious symbols come back. Whatever verse was there, caste system rigidified. All those things happened. Even though Bhakti movement was against caste system, this helped in rigidifying a lot of things, and the culture of debate went away. Shankaracharya had to fall on the feet of the Chandala or Kirata. Later day, Bhakti movement made him to look as if he is the avatar of Shiva. But in the original story, it is a Chandala who asks a question, and the Shankaracharya falls on his feet because whoever teaches you is the Guru. But later, as the Bhakti movement came, they made it into Shiva, and the Shankaracharya as the avatar of Shiva, and lot many things. Right. Of the great intellect. So this is continuing even now. Now, if you see, we are yet to come out of that Bhakti. Everywhere there is a cult movement, whether it is in national level, whether it is in the state level, whichever state, whichever party rules, it's a cult which is going on. From Kerala to Bengal to the center, and don't want to talk politics, to Maharashtra to anywhere, it's a cult, and all are cult leaders who are following.
Right.
So the space for, even if you see the space for leaders like, say, Nehru, lot of flaws, lot of great things, but they all belong to a certain era where debate rather than personal worship had some space. Whereas as you come to Indira Gandhi and so on, the cult, went back to our default mode. And we went on, and we're still continuing, whichever the leaders are there, still continuing in films, film actors, we worship them. Kalidasa didn't become God, okay, but third-rate film actors become God now. That's the difference.
Anand, let me bring you back to the topic, which is basically from a lot of discussion on an exciting subject of Mahabharata and all these epics and all that, and overall the world view on various civilizations and all that. Let's come back to the topic on meditation itself. So, or mindfulness, or how to keep you going in these difficult times. These are very, very difficult times, the pandemic, and our country has faced a lot of pain and suffering. Most of our friends and relatives we know, somewhere or other, we know people who have directly got impacted by this in some way or other. So what is your giveaway today? I mean, what would you like to tell everyone, considering that you have your own foundation in basic values that drive you?
These tough times, we cannot wish away with it. We have to suffer through that. We can keep blaming people, but there is no other way, because it's beyond our control as of now, except for taking personal precautions and all. This could be a very stressful time. This is a stressful time, no doubt about that. So I don't know what advice I can give. I can only say what I do. One thing is, I indulge in a lot of reading. Reading takes me away from, it's an escapism perhaps, but it takes me away and makes me work, makes my brain work through the imagination. So I read widely English books, Malayalam books, whatever I could keep hands on. One way to keep your sanity is to read. Then you find that we are still living in one of the best of times. Because as you read history, as you read historical fiction, as you read all these things, it was a much more violent and dark world, even 100 years back or 200 years back. Average lifespan was 25 years. So if you have lived up to 40, 50, already you have lived more than, it might not be a big solace. But you start thinking, 99% of the humanity since humans evolved would not have had the luck to see what you have seen.
At this age,
across the 25 years, 18 years, all around, if you take 18 years, is the average lifespan of humans. Whereas now in India, it's 70 years. Many European countries or places like Kerala, it is reaching 82 years, 84 years, the average lifespan. So we are already living in one of the best of times.
So basically gratitude, you're saying have gratitude.
It is, you naturally have gratitude once you think like that. So reading makes you think about all these things a lot and understand that all these things has happened, whether it is Ramayana or Mahabharata, whether it happened or not, whether it is a fictional story or not. They all talk about human nature, and you are not alone. You have got so many friends through the time travel, through the time and space travel. You can go to the future, you can go, books are magic that way. More than films and all, they feed you. Everything is spoon-fed. Whereas here you are imagining. Somebody talks about, Akbar. The way you imagine the Akbar's court might not be the way I imagine it. So you are recreating it. You are living that.
Right.
So reading becomes one of the important part. And one small thing, what I would say, it might be difficult in cities because after coming to Mumbai, I am finding it very disappointing. Because you don't have sky here. You have only fog. But if you live in a place where you can see stars, ensure that every night you see the stars. Every night you look at the sky, at least for 5 minutes. It does a lot to your
meditation.
Meditation means, see, it is a Mayavada to really see. Everything is you will start taking life very lightly. Scientifically, I'm telling you. Why? Because what is Maya? Everything is an illusion. If you look at the sky, you are seeing an illusion. Why? Because the light takes many million years to travel sometimes. So you are seeing a star. Imagine you are seeing a star and looking at it. The star would have been dead, say 5 lakh years back. The light is reaching now. So you are looking at something which doesn't exist and think that it exists and imagining about it. It's Maya. And you are looking at a blank space. The space, there already a star might be getting born now, but you are not seeing it. So what exists, you are not seeing. What doesn't exist, you are seeing. And you are looking into time. You are looking into 2 lakh years back, 2 crore years back, and you are looking into future also. Suddenly, once you think like that, and you are like a grain of sand in the entire universe. How does all these problems matter? It gives you a kind of, you feel overwhelmed and you feel so important that you are able to perceive this. It is a ethereal feeling once you do it with this thought. And then all the things you read, all the mantras or all those things you read, it comes back to you. So,
Right.
I don't know, it is certain things you cannot, anandam, ajnadam, avarnaniyam, they say, no, it's infinite. It is unknown. You cannot describe. You are too small to describe. But you are too important and you are too good to perceive it. Just take out time, 5 minutes, and watch the sky, watch the moon. Nature does a lot.
Be in the moment.
Be in the
Yes.
moment, I don't know. I am not a fan of the pop psychology of be in the moment. Forgive me if I offend anyone.
No.
I don't believe in be in the moment because that is very reductionist. I see a lot of gurus tell that. That's very reductionist. I see. For me, as I said, no, I will be at various places in the given moment. I feel that is more expansive for me. Otherwise, you are just concentrating on I am being in the moment. I am cutting onion and just cutting.
But what I'm saying is, even in that expansion of thought from various spaces that you follow, you're not necessarily attaching yourself to that. You just in a joy, in a space that's quite blissful, if I may say.
Yeah. So that is not that exactly. Is it being in the moment? I don't know. Because when many gurus say be in the moment, I have seen people forcing to be in the moment, and that's quite stressful if you ask me. Just let you be you. And what will happen? Let the mind wander. Mind's nature is to wander. Let the mind wander, and it goes and picks up so many hundred things from the past, from the future, from what you have read, your fond memories of your childhood, about your parents, grandparents, friends. It's such a joy to remember about the past because human mind is so fascinating that mostly, unless it is a very big pain, only what is small pains, it glosses it over. And the past, it gives a golden hue. It gives a beautiful hue to the past. That is why we all love nostalgia. That's why when you hear some old songs, you sit with a cup of coffee or water or your drinks, you feel an inexplicable joy. Right. Because you are traveling with that. So your mind is wandering. You are not being in the moment. You are being in some other moment which went past long ago.
Mm-hmm.
Or some other moment which may happen in the future. Dream a lot about the past, about the future. So Ruskin Bond says, Ruskin Bonds is something which I read many times because Thomas Hardy, Ruskin Bond, and some of the poets in Malayalam like Vailar or Changambura, all these things, what they do, they take you into this world. You can feel the fragrance of the flowers. You can feel the wind on you might be sitting inside a room. But you are being in many other moments in many other person's world and in their brain and in their mind and the dream. What could be more fascinating in life than that?
Absolutely. It's a parallel world that you create.
You are living in multiple worlds. Multiverses at the same time.
Multi-dimensional world.
Multi-dimensional world. And you are not restricted to your body. You are not restricted to your physical body. You go beyond that.
So what are the new things coming up from your end? I mean, I hear there are movies, there are books, there are series. Can you tell us?
Yeah, a lot of them are there.
Very exciting.
A lot of them are there. One is one big 2023 only. It was announced. The movie based on Karna is coming with Rakesh Omprakash Mehra as the director. Ronis Kawala.
Can you repeat that? That's who? Who's the director?
Rakesh Omprakash Mehra. The Reng De Basandi and Milka Singh and Delhi Seikh's director.
That's big. That's big.
Huge. Ronis, one of the biggest films. Ronis Kawala production. 2023 is what we are thinking of. Scripting is over almost. That is coming. Then I am doing a series with Rohan Sippy for that will be soon coming. It's a thriller, a bit away from what I have written. It's a limited series, around 8 episodes. It's a thriller I am doing with Rohan Sippy. Then in Audible, I am right. It will come this month or next month, perhaps June end or July. Different Ramayanas and different versions. This is from my notes from all my book, my almost 20 years of research into this for writing all these books. It's a non-fiction book trying to explain Ramayana in simple terms. But how I am doing it is there are more than 300, 400 versions of Ramayana and 1,000 or odd versions of Uparamayanas. So I am telling the story as everybody knows. Then I say in this Muslim Ramayana, it is told like this. In Indonesian Ramayana, it is told like this. In Tamil Ramayana, it is told like this. Like that, I am just, every event I am going through that and saying, this is a lesson we can learn. That is coming as an audio book in Audible. Then in Storytel, which also I have written, that is...
when will that come up?
June, July, it should come up, the audio book. Then Valmiki's Women, the female perspective of Ramayana is coming through Amazon Westland. This month it was supposed to come. It has been postponed due to pandemic. Maybe September it will come. Then with Storytel, I am retelling Nala Damayanti story as a drama with some actors are giving the voice. They're like radio drama kind of
thing. So Storytel, am I right? Storytel is...
Storytel. It's like audio books. No? Both Audible and this thing are audio books. That's becoming big now. So that is coming. And then...
right.
I am writing another myth as a thriller for next year, and that is halfway through. And also what I have finished is one more, my Vanara is coming as a film. So that announcement will come soon. It's coming as
when is that coming? That's a big one.
That again will be among in the same time, 2023. That is also signed and the rights have been sold. So that also is coming as a film. Then I am doing some show for Doordarshan and all about Indian history, discovery of India, unsung heroes of India, which will cover not the mainstream heroes, but the heroes like, say, Palshi Raja, Martanda Varma, Rash Bihari Bose. And, across all the states, I am taking 3-4 people, Veeravande Kattaboman, and writing 30 minutes documentary style of episodes. Birsa Munda, Bakshi Jagabandhu from Odisha. Like that, everyone, lot of unsung heroes of the Indian freedom struggle, starting from 1498, when Vasco da Gama arrived. That for Doordarshan I am doing, it's a non-fiction. A lot of work is going on.
Wonderful. Very nice.
Wow, that's absolutely inspirational stuff. Sushmita, so I'll hand it over to you. I think Anand, we've taken a lot of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for
so much.
Wonderful.